evening. Welcome to On Deck with Mercury. I'm Mercury Payton, Town Manager here in Vienna. We have a wonderful topic to talk about this evening, and it is the Town of Vienna's legislative agenda. And I have with me here the Town Attorney Steve Briglia. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Good evening, Mr. Town Manager.
As we get going, we always talk about the 4 things to keep us safe. First is washing our hands, stay home if we're sick, social distance, keep a good distance when we can, and wear your face covering whenever possible. So tonight we're going to talk about our legislative agenda. It's something that I know that is near and dear to Steve's heart. I know I'm passionate about the budget process and all those things. I'm almost as passionate about the legislative agenda, but I know that's really something that's in your wheelhouse. So if you could please tell us exactly what the legislative agenda is, why the Town of Vienna does it, and how this impacts other jurisdictions as well.
Sure, Mercury. Thank you for having me, and I hope I can make this as interesting as possible. A lot of people think it's a boring topic. As you indicated, it's something I do get a little excited about, and it is something that comes up every year for the town. And what a legislative agenda is what the town is asking our elected representatives in the General Assembly to address issues, and they can be legal, they can be financial, or they can be what we would call is an authorization bill that allows the town to do something that we can't do now. And so we come up with a legislative agenda every year, and have for many, many years, to ask respectfully our General Assembly to consider bills that will address things of importance to the town of Vienna.
Yeah, that's really important. Our tax dollars go down there, and so certainly we want to make sure that our voice is being heard. So how does this legislative agenda put together here in Vienna?
Well, as I mentioned, we do it every year, and the first step is we have a running list of items, and we have carryover items, things that didn't get addressed the year before that we want to keep going back to the General Assembly on. And then there are new items. What happens is the town council, as most people know, in Vienna, town council is very active out in the community. The mayor is very active out in the community. Members of the public suggest things to town council. How come we can't do this, or why do we do something a certain way? And so first off, the town council comes up with policies or goals that they want to try to accomplish. And sometimes we need statutory authority for it. Sometimes we already have it. Often there are long-range goals that would require funding from the state. Those are generally long-range goals. They can be something as mundane but necessary as road maintenance funding and grants for public improvements, things that we don't have enough resources for currently that we're asking the state to help us with. So I would say the primary source of where our legislative comes from is our elected officials. But also staff and myself play a part in making recommendations to the town council, some things that we feel need to be addressed. I mean, purchasing authority, something as simple as that would come from our Department of Finance. Zoning and planning authority would come out of the Department of Planning and Zoning. Environmental authority coming out of Public Works. Stormwater management, sedimentary and erosion control. Again, it sounds like really boring things, but it's very important for those departments and for the town to be able to address those. And over the years, we've had, if you look at our legislative agendas in the past, a lot of those items relate to those areas. And then finally, ideas received just in general from the public and our boards and commissions. Our boards and commissions are comprised of citizens of the town of Vienna, just like our town council, and they come up with ideas, suggestions. So we basically get a rough draft every year, circulate it to the town council and staff, and then usually in late September, early October, we meet with our 2 elected officials, our state senator, Chap Peterson, and our delegate, representative to the House of Delegates, Mark Keem, and we have a work session. Council has a work session with them, and staff's present, and we show them the rough draft, and they give us their input. And some of them, they'll flat out tell us that's dead on arrival. That's just not going to happen in this General Assembly session. It's been other jurisdictions have tried to get that authority or try to get that funding, and or they'll say that's a great idea, and we'll sponsor it, and we'll draft the bills for it. So we get that input, and they don't always agree with the town's legislative agenda. I mean, they have other constituents other than the town and the town citizens. But we get tremendous support from our senator and our delegate, Senator Peterson and Delegate Keem. And so then after that input, the town council holds a public hearing to, again, get formal public input. And this year it was in early November, November 2nd. Council held they had a work session first and then a public hearing. And then they prioritized this year the formal legislative agenda, and that's what is currently been submitted to our legislators.
Yeah, that's a really good process. I really enjoy seeing that process unfold each year. What do our representatives and the General Assembly members, what do they do with Vienna's legislative agenda once they've received it?
Well, they totally ignore it. No, I'm serious. No, they take it very seriously, right. Actually. Depending on the type of issues that are presented in the legislative agenda, they'll have to formally request bills. Sometimes there's been carryover bills that are from prior years that are in a study committee, and we're making sure that those stay, on the front burner. We want to make sure that any new bills get to the right committees, and that's the responsibility of the General Assembly. We don't have any direct control over that. And often the town and you see in our legislative agenda that's passed this year is we want to make sure that if bills do get introduced, and we hear rumors that somebody's going to introduce a bill to cut funding to the local police department or to decrease local authority into certain zoning, things that we already have. We say, listen, we'd like you to oppose those bills if they come up. So those are things that are part of our part of our legislative agenda, and that our representatives keep their eyes open and ears open for what's going to happen in the General Assembly and the upcoming agenda. So what happens, though, depends on the year. Because Virginia has what's called a biennial budget, which means they pass a 2-year budget. Governor prepares a budget, proposes, and the General Assembly passes, and it's good for 2 years. So on an even year, and this is 2021, but on an even year, they have a full legislative session. It's scheduled to go 60 days, and a lot of what they do is in dealing with money, finance. So if the town has items that require any funding from the state, that's not already in the budget from years past, continuing things, then you better get on their agenda in an even year, and that's the full session. Because in the odd number years, it's called a short session, it's only 30 days, it's really there to do a double check on making sure that the budget's okay, and then any other items that they can get through. So this is an off legislative, a short legislative session this year. So the number of bills that our legislators can introduce is limited from a full year. And so, their ability to pre-file bills that we would want them to introduce, and other jurisdictions can introduce bills as well, is going to be limited in a short session. So this year it's going to be a shorter session, so there'll be fewer legislative items that are going to be there. And if they have any fiscal impact, as I mentioned, the budget's already set. So it's going to be hard to get anything. You go asking for money this year, it's going to be hard, even if they had it, which this year, as everybody is aware, it's a COVID year. So that's generally what happens. They in a given year, they would introduce bills, hopefully ones that we like or support, or oppose ones that the town doesn't support, and keep us apprised of what's going on down in the General Assembly. And things are going to happen fast now. General Assembly starts tomorrow, actually. They go in session, so the 30 days starts tomorrow.
Wow. Fastly moving forward here. So tell us about a couple of items in the past that Vienna has included on its legislative agenda that the General Assembly has supported and adopted. Maybe a few examples. Okay.
Well, I went back and looked at our legislative agendas going back, about 10 years or so, and I would say, it happens, but it doesn't happen often that in any one year we have something on our legislative agenda and it gets immediately passed. And I think that's a good point to make to people, is that it takes time. But a saying I use is a good idea is a good idea. So, I mean, sometimes you thought it was a good idea one year, and it turns out, well, that's going to have a huge impact on Tidewater area if the General Assembly passed that, or the Southwest Virginia area is going to really hate that, so it's not going to get anywhere. In other years, people like it, but it went to the wrong committee. So they're like, we don't know what to do with this. We think it actually should be in another area first, or it needs to study. So it can take a few years. So in the past, I looked at what we've done, and you know, some of them are little, again, nuts and bolts, things that are important to the town. We went to the General Assembly and asked for more authority for residential speeding violations, to be able to put a mandatory minimum in residential speed zones. Problem is you got to put up specific signs for it, but a lot of jurisdictions, including Fairfax County, loved it and have used it. We've used it in a couple areas where there's high traffic, high volume of speeders, and that was our idea. We did that. The other thing, which I think we're very proud of, and it didn't always happen in 1 year, but is we've played an instrumental role in having the state code updated on local stormwater management and sedimentary control, which a lot of people think, well, what are you talking about? That's the runoff of the rainwater and what comes off your property and off the streets. It has tremendous impact for the poor town of Vienna that was built out in the 50s and 60s. And our storm sewers were designed on older standards. And our creek beds, a lot of people, private and public property, you would just level off the land right up to the edge of the creek bed. So sure, why wouldn't you? You grade it out. There's nothing wrong with that. It has a terrible impact on the Chesapeake Bay. So in the early 90s, the federal government and the state said we have to do something about the Chesapeake Bay. It was in horrendous shape. So they passed what's called the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. Sounds great. It's got a great goal. The problem is they said, okay, all the localities have to figure out a way to control your stormwater runoff, the sediment that's going into our creeks, the pollution that's going into there. It was a huge issue and largely unfunded. So what the town did is ask for additional local authority, both in its zoning ordinance and its stormwater management provisions of the town code, to require builders, developers, and also put a burden on the town to improve its facilities to address those long-term goals of increasing basically reducing runoff, bad runoff into the Chesapeake and our local tributaries. So we've made tremendous progress, and you know, the town was instrumental. Single development pretty much has to come totally modern. When you tear down a house and regrade the lot, you got to bring that property up to the modern standards for stormwater management, where a lot of the subdivisions currently that were built out in the 50s and 60s are under the old standards. So this is, and since we've had a lot of redevelopment, that's really been a valuable tool for the town. That's, I think, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand or don't maybe appreciate that the town, through its legislative agenda, has been able to do, and oppose other efforts to maybe shift the burden of improving the stormwater management 100% on the people instead of developers when they have the opportunity to upgrade their systems. So I think that one jumped out at me. There's a lot of little smaller ones we've done over the years. You know, the tree canopies, we've been pushing to get expansion of our authority to require faster tree canopies. When a property's developed, they almost always have to take down a lot of the trees, and that affects the tree canopy. And so that's one that's a perennial. We haven't accomplished that yet, but I think we're making progress on that. So I think the stormwater management is one of, I would highlight that as something the town has been very fortunate in being able to accomplish through its legislative agenda.
Yeah, that's great. So that's the past. In this current legislative agenda, the council has identified 5 priorities that are submitted to the General Assembly through Delegate Keene and Senator Peterson. Tell us a little bit about each one of these and why they're priorities. So I'll kind of go, I guess, item by item. The first one, the opposition to ending qualified immunity or making changes to sovereign immunity. And this has to do with law enforcement. Let's talk a little bit about the town's position on that and why that's important.
Well, this is one of these kind of sleeper agenda items that most people really don't pay attention to. The qualified immunity and sovereign immunity apply not only to law enforcement. That's why it's on the front burner, though, in the General Assembly. It applies to multiple areas of government operations, including our public works, including our parks and recs. And what it does, so the basic premise of qualified immunity is that people don't really think of it this way, but localities are derivative bodies in Virginia, meaning they get all their power from the General Assembly, and the General Assembly says, we don't want to come and do your local zoning, we don't want to come and do your trash pickup and your water survey. You all are local, you all handle those, and they give us the authority to do that. Okay? But we become an instrumentality of the state government. So the concept of sovereign immunity is you can't sue the sovereign for providing public services. It kind of makes sense. You're suing yourself is the term I like to say. So sovereign immunity is based basically on that, is you're suing yourself. I mean, you all say you want to do your zoning, you all say you want to have police forces, and then you're going to sue yourself if there's something related to that. Well, we're going to give you some protection. That's the concept of sovereign immunity or qualified immunity. And it is qualified in most situations. It's not a blanket immunity, and most people don't understand that as well. So, having said that, there is a large body of law that's been applied over the years that says it applies in these situations and not in these situations. Like, you can't violate somebody's civil rights as a local government and say, oh, well, we have sovereign immunity. Black letter law, you can't do that. You can't run over or damage somebody's property, right? If we're just with a big backhoe, we're replacing a water main, and we just tear up somebody's front yard. We got constitutional protections about a taking of somebody's property without compensation. We may be able to dig the hole to fix the water main, but if we damage that person's property, we have to compensate them for the damage. It's fundamental rights. None of that is affected by qualified immunity or sovereign immunity. They are limited to certain areas. Well, there's been a push in the General Assembly, and not just by it's not coming from our folks, but other people who want to just take that away and treat us as the town of Vienna would be treated like a private company. You have to go to court every time there's anything related. Anybody would have standing to bring a case against you. Well, localities uniformly think that's a bad idea, and local government attorneys agree that you can always look at it and say, are there areas where we're not doing as good a job and being responsible? But I would submit that a lot of what's being proposed is not gauged towards that. But I'll be flat out. Some of my colleagues, attorneys, look at it as a way of suing a deep pocket. I mean, the public coffers have a lot of money, right? And if you're paying out lawsuits, it's going to increase the price of business, the cost of doing business. It might also limit what some localities are willing to do, what services they're able to provide. Parks and recs, for instance. I mean, if you're worried about liability because somebody gets injured when they're playing on a ball field, even though you would say there's a lot of assumption of risk when you decide to go out and play tennis or jog on a track. If we have civil liability, if somebody gets injured, or it's not that you don't have liability, it's that they can bring the action against you even if it's dismissed. There's a lot of money in defending these cases. So those are some of the concerns we have. So that is a really big issue. It's why it's number one on the town's legislative agenda. And so we have a top 5, the legislative agenda that's been passed by the town council. The council ranked them by priority. And so that was one because it's come up really quickly, and it's been kicked around a little bit in the special session. So the town's expecting to see some bills and have asked our representatives to oppose that.
And thinking about that one too, it's not that the town feels like it's being insensitive to those who might feel like something's happened that shouldn't have happened. And I think that's one of the impetuses of all of this from last summer, with a lot of activities that governments have played a role in, not the greatest shining moments for a lot of those governments. And our position on this is that we do hold our employees accountable, for being bad actors, whether it's a Parks and Rec employee or Public Works employee or me or a police officer. I think that what we're saying is that we're responsible for holding them accountable. And if we go to a certain level, then it's going to make it that much more difficult to actually provide the service. Is that kind of where we're?
That's what it boils down to. I mean, it's not trying to get out of accountability or responsibility for your actions. I mean, it's not that at all. And as most people know in Vienna, you know, if they have a complaint, they pick up the phone, they get a person, they get the mayor, they get the town manager, they'll get the directors, and it should, and I would say in the majority of situations, even if the citizen doesn't like the answer, they feel like it was responded to.
So the next one here is Liberty Amendments Day. This is number 2. Is there anything you want to kind of talk about that?
Well, no. I mean, this is, you know, I think there's a lot of things that, you know, a good idea is a good idea, and I think it's good to give credit for where it comes from. But I mean, this really sprung from, you know, your idea, Mercury, to, you know, there was a recognition of Juneteenth recently, and you know, it's just such a special and neat celebration that started in Texas, and you know, but there's so much more that it stands for, and I think you started talking about, you know, what about a Liberty Amendments Day? And I know you were talking to people, and I loved it. I was an attorney. I mean, there's lots of great things in our Constitution. People don't look. Maybe they looked at it when they were in high school government class, but I think it's a tremendous way for people to recognize some of the great rights you have and liberties in this country and protections that you have under our Constitution. So, I mean, I'll let you explain the concept of it, but it's the reason it's number 2 on our legislative agenda. It is timely. It is, you know, I think very much needed in this Commonwealth where a lot of people don't realize the first 10 amendments to the Constitution came out of really the Virginia's Constitution, which had these liberties and rights protected in them, drafted by George Mason and included in the Virginia Constitution. So a lot of great history. So the General Assembly is being asked by the town of Vienna to adopt a resolution and then eventually hopefully have a Liberty Day as well. But I'll let you explain the details of that.
Sure, yeah, and I'll be brief because next month I'll talk in more detail about it. But last summer, as you mentioned in June, you know, Governor Northam, the week of Juneteenth, he said that he was going to allow state employees to have that day off. I think it was a Friday. And I think it was like a Tuesday or Wednesday when he announced that. And I'm connected with the region here, and we weren't sure what to do as a region. I mean, you go jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Some were going to have that day off and others weren't. And so as I started looking at it, and then I looked a little bit deeper, well, you know, thinking about the slaves in Texas learning 2 years later that the Emancipation Proclamation had been given by President Lincoln, looking a little further, the 13th Amendment is actually what freed slaves nationwide. And so then I started looking at other amendments beyond that. In the 14th Amendment, you know, due process and equal protection under the law, which, if you think about the events of this past summer, strikes right at the heart of that issue and topic. And then the 15th Amendment gives former slaves the right to vote, and by extension, others. But then you look at the amendment after that, I think it was the 19th Amendment, is giving women the right to vote. And what struck me as I was kind of doing all of this research during that time period this past summer, that was the centennial last year of women getting the right to vote. And I'm thinking, I hadn't heard much about that topic at all in the broader, wider media or conversation. And probably is very important to recognize that, even more so some of the others, given that it was a centennial, one would think. So I just thought that it would be good to kind of wrap those 4 great amendments up into something that we could celebrate that would bring everyone together, that would bring, no matter what walk of life you're in and your vantage point of life, you can appreciate due process, equal protection under the law, right to vote, citizenship. So that was kind of the impetus of it, and I'm kind of actually surprised that it's gotten this far. It was an idea last summer, and here we are talking about it for something for the General Assembly. So,
well, it sounds like it's got traction. That's a term you use when you think a bill or a item in the General Assembly is going to go somewhere, and from what we're hearing initially, A lot of people think it's a great idea, not just local people that know Vienna, but people across the state. So it'd be nice to see that get passed. And because it's an off year and there's no fiscal impact, unless they include a holiday, which initially they would probably do, as you're suggesting, a month of recognition. But
So the next one here, the third one, is opposition to reduction in the current local government authority to review and approve applications for use of public right-of-way. Sounds very academic. So what is?
Oh, Mercury, this sounds like such a sleepy topic, and who really cares about this? It has broader implications. Why it's number 3, and we have a lot of things on our agenda, and there's the top 5, and there's other ones that are farther down. But almost every session of the General Assembly, there are private entities that come to the General Assembly and ask the General Assembly to change the way localities handle and really approve applications for the use of the public right-of-way and manage it. That's the term. Because localities are charged by the General Assembly and in the Virginia Constitution with managing the right-of-ways in those jurisdictions. And what does that mean? Well, we all have electricity in our house, okay? We all have water and sewer coming to our house. We all have telecom in most of our houses, high-speed internet, cable channels. We have gas lines in some of our houses. All those things are public utilities. They serve the general public. And the majority of those lines, those facilities, are in the public right-of-way until they get to your property line. So it's very important. So the General Assembly says manage that. We're not going to manage it down in Richmond. We're part-time. We're only down here for 60 or 30 days a year. You guys do that day in, day out. And for the most part, localities have done it very, very well. One of the things you do when you learn about municipal operations is the amazing amount of infrastructure that localities have and this country has. So we manage that. So the telephone poles, the power poles, the pipes, all those things, and as much underground as we can get them now, but a lot of them are still above ground. Well, these companies come in and they say, well, listen, we want to put these things up in the public right away, and we don't have to go through franchises and licenses. We don't have to have public hearings of whether this is good for the community. We just want to put these things up and start making money. And we don't want to pay for the right to use the public right of way, even though we're making money off of it. Well, that's a break in what the Constitution says and what the current status of the law is. And I'm not saying that localities should prevent people coming in, telecom companies, from running lines. That is for the benefit. I mean, we encourage competition in the town. We have more than 2 telecom providers, but we have 2 major players. That's great for the town. That's great for the citizens here. I know a lot of people, they only have 1 provider. That's it. They may not even be very good at it. We're very fortunate in this area. So, but the managing of the right-of-ways is also very important. We have to have a process. It has to be public, has to be transparent, and that's how it's always been, quite frankly. So the town views this, and the town council views this as a step backwards. And there's been really a lot of lobbying over the last 10, 15 years by these entities to undermine and to take away localities' ability to manage the right-of-way for the benefit of everybody, because that's what it's there for. I mean, they can always go out and acquire land and put their facilities, like if they wanted, which didn't have any public benefit. But as soon as it has a public benefit, that's where the town, other localities are involved. So this is a really important provision. It's been coming up more and more lately, and that's why it's number 3, to make sure that our representatives know what the town's position is on this.
The next one is opposition to reduction or elimination of local land use authority.
Again, that's one of those things that's near and dear to a locality's heart. The General Assembly, when they gave us our charter, they said, listen, we're not going to tell you where to put your roads are, and if you want to have 2 houses on an acre or 4 houses on an acre where your business district's going to be, we're going to let you all do that. That's local government 101. Lay your streets out, put your water systems in. Where are the houses going to be? Where are where's the commercial district going to be? And that's the orderly planning that you have in any planning and zoning department in any locality. Well, again, and a lot of times it's driven by forces in the public sector that say, well, these localities are getting in our way. You know, why can't we build a high-rise in the middle of a residential zone? I mean, that's what the market says should be there, right? Well, the market may have its own reasons for something, but in the orderly development of a community, you know, we're not talking about 1 or 2 years, get your profit, sell your building, get out. We're talking about building a community, and as we know in Vienna, we're incorporated in 1890. We're still building our community. It is a long-term process, long-term goals, and they're not always in sync with what, you know, a developer or property owner wants to do, develop their property, sell, and get out. And so, you know, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I mean, you know, we have a vibrant development community in the town and around us, but it needs to be orderly. And that's what I say zoning, and a lot of this thing is zoning brings, you know, order to the development chaos that you would have otherwise.
Is this an example in some way of how the government that's closest to the people govern the best? In other words, you don't have the land use coming from the federal government. You shouldn't really have it coming from Richmond necessarily, but it should come from the localities that are local, where residents have elected their local representatives, their council members, to make such decisions because it's closest to them. They understand what they want for their community. Is that a part of the concept of the government closest to the people? You know,
it absolutely is, and it goes to why there are local charters for towns and cities. The good people of the town of Vienna, it wasn't a town at the time, went down to the General Assembly and just before 1890 and said, we want to do these things in our area, which was really a rural area, a little crossroads. Railroad came through Vienna. But we want to develop this, we need this authority. And they're like, well, we don't want to do it, so you guys do it. So yeah, I mean, you all know what you want. We don't want to tell you what you need to do in Vienna. And so that's where it does spring from, is you're right. I mean, you know, the best people are the people there with the boots on the grounds, and they're working to build their community.
Yeah, yeah. This fifth one here, support change to VDOT, Virginia Department of Transportation, local road maintenance funding formula from lane mileage to lane volume.
This is something that's been perennially on our legislative agenda. It ruffles some feathers in other parts of the states where they benefit from having the lane mileage formula the way it is as opposed to the usage. And you would say, well, of course this makes sense. A road that's used more needs more maintenance funds. That's not currently how the process works. We get money from VDOT for our roads maintenance, and we, as you know, our director of Public Works stretches that money as far as he can. Fortunately, the fact that the town pushes for this every year, year after year, there have been other changes in the funding formulas. It's not annual funding, but there's a lot more projects where the VDOT has more authority to designate one-time funds for certain projects, or shared revenue where the town contributes 50% or even less, and VDOT can match that money. And the town's been very fortunate to take advantage of some of those programs, which really didn't exist 15, 20 years ago. And I think the towns have been asking for this for 15 or so years, at least. So it's not that we're continuing to put pressure in a negative way. I think we're just calling attention to, especially in Northern Virginia and the Tidewater areas, the tremendous amounts of volume of traffic on our roads increases the wear, and yet most people don't know that. The cities and towns and some of the counties, Arlington County maintains the roads as well, has to pay for that. And the money we get from the state is not enough to meet those needs. So it has to come from either local taxes or the money we get from VDOT in Richmond.
Yeah. So are there any other items in our current 2021 legislative agenda that may be of particular interest to our residents here in Vienna?
Well, we have a number of items. There's, you know, the top 5, and then, you know, then you have the secondary priorities, which are 6 through 10, and then there's some other legislative requests, you know, 11 through 16 that were adopted by the council, and some of them are really nuts and bolts things that we do every year, and that's why they got moved down, and we're not too worried about them. It could be, you know, 599 funding, and you're like, well, what is that? That's the state funding for local law enforcement. In many jurisdictions, you get in the rural areas, state funds this local sheriff's department, and there's no local funding. But obviously we need more law enforcement than just a sheriff's office, and most dense communities, cities, towns, and more urban counties have a local police department. And so, you know, they're doing what was traditionally a state role. And so what the 599 money is designed is to help augment the local expenditure of funds for its law enforcement. And so that's something that comes up every year, and it's a funding request. We just want to make sure that doesn't get eroded. Something as minor as you know, working to a way to get license plates, town license plates. That's on there. That's a fun one. They're not all boring, I don't think. You know, some of them are kind of fun. Things about change. We've been asking the General Assembly to address the issue of advertisement for public hearings. Currently, it has to be in a newspaper of general circulation. Well, as we all know, there's fewer and fewer of those, and even then, people are not looking to the newspapers for those kind of things anymore. Where they used to, legal ads. So we're looking to help solve an issue that we perceive, especially in Northern Virginia, where people get their news electronically for the most part, and their notices electronically. More and more, that's how they want it. Little things like that we work on that stay in our legislative agenda. So it's you know, as an attorney, it's fun, I would say, you know, challenging. And then, you know, the next step to this is we go down to the General Assembly. This year it's going to be virtually, and we make sure that our voices are getting heard. We obviously have the ear of Senator Peterson and Delegate Keene, but we talk to other folks that we know. We team up with other jurisdictions to hopefully help us find some allies, and they can be other towns similarly situated. They can be Fairfax County, who works with us on a lot of items. And the town is very active in the Virginia Municipal League, which is an association of localities across the state. And Vienna was one of the founding members of that. We're active in the Towns of Northern Virginia Association, which I know you sit on and the mayor sit on regularly. Those are allies when we go down to General Assembly to help with other members of the General Assembly to gain support, get our bills out of committee, get them on the floor for a vote.
Yeah, yeah. It is actually kind of fun, actually. What generally is the success rate of the town's agenda items, and how do you define success?
That sounds like a lawyer talking. How do you define success? I think how we define success is not just whether a bill passed, but if other bills that were contrary to where our legislative agenda didn't get passed. They died in committee, and there's a lot of those. The town has made its position clear, and although there may not be a specific bill that addresses ours, bills that would have been the opposite don't get passed. So I think we have a higher success rate in that, because they're like, oh, well, we hear Vienna doesn't like that. And you say, well, who cares what Vienna thinks? Well, Vienna's been active for many, many years, and it's usually not just Vienna. When we hear about something, we talk to our friends at VML and towns in Northern Virginia. And so, you know, because we are active and have been active for many, many years, that helps us to prevent what I would say really things people hadn't thought about that well. If it's a good idea, it's a good idea, right? And if we need a little bit more time to look into it. So we have tremendous success, I would say, in that regard, of making sure things that are going to really adversely the town don't pass. Now, things that we've needed, you know, if I'd say percentages, they say never give percentages. It's probably 10, 15% over the years that we've got our bills. A lot of them have become moot. We wanted a bill, you know, passed, a law passed that would address something we perceived as a problem. Say the stormwater management. We have a lot of stormwater management bills we've proposed, and they really haven't been passed, but the state made it moot because, for example, stormwater management and sedimentary control used to be separate. And we said, you've got to give us local authority to address these things. And so what they did instead of is they went to a universal approach, referred it to a big study committee, got the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, involved in it, drafted regulatory provisions, engineering standards, and then they passed basically an omnibus bill and said, this is how you do it, and really addressed a lot of the concerns the town had. So we didn't need individual authority anymore. Passed a statewide regulations and a bill that allowed that. So I think that's probably our biggest success while I've been town attorney, is the transition from a really antiquated way of dealing with stormwater management and sedimentary control into what we have now, which really helps, and really helps the water quality. And you almost, well, you're not seeing it overnight, but you really have seen improvements in our local streams and in the Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about how Vienna and other communities work with state representatives in the General Assembly.
Well, I mentioned the Virginia Municipal League, and that is the statewide organization that the town's been a member of and very active. We've had members of our town council be on the steering committee. Charlie Robinson was one of the first presidents, a longtime mayor. And so we've been very fortunate to have, a strong voice in the Virginia Municipal League, and they have a lot of cachet, and their voice carries a lot of weight across the state and with the General Assembly. I mentioned the towns in Northern Virginia, the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, of which you're active, and this is all about building alliances with communities that are similarly situated with us, have this common goals, common interests, and making sure that the local authority to be able to make decisions locally and implement things is done. One of the things, I think I might have left it off, but one of the things we try to ensure through our legislative agenda and working with our friends is a lot of times General Assembly will pass something, and it is a great idea, but there's no state funding for it. Everybody likes, oh, it's an unfunded mandate. Yeah, we get those. In Virginia, the federal, you hear about it on the federal side, and a lot of what we do in working with other groups is to make sure, hey, that's a great idea. We're not against that, but you have to give us some money to implement that at the local level. And if it's an off year, that usually means it has a fiscal impact, so it's not going to pass, or maybe it gets studied, and we'll say we're going to pass over that and see if we can get some money in the budget the next year. So those are positive ways how we work with members of the General Assembly. They want to pass something, and maybe they hadn't really considered the scope of the fiscal impact. And when we work with our friends in other jurisdictions, it comes across as a louder voice, and a voice of reason in many cases. That's what we want to be, is a voice of reason.
Right. And what I found over the years too is, if it's important to us, it's likely important to other jurisdictions that are similar in size or in our region. And oftentimes, a lot of these ideas come from ordinary residents, ordinary citizens who have an issue or a concern, and they raise it to their council member. The council member takes it, asks to put it on the legislative agenda, and you work on it, and then next thing you know, you're partnering up with, Falls Church, Fairfax County, and Alexandria. Next thing you know, we're taking it down to the General Assembly. So it's like a team effort, almost a grassroots to some degree.
Well, and occasionally, Mercury, we do have a unique situation. I mean, Vienna was one of the first communities to have a large-scale, single-lot tear-downs and redevelopment. You would have people doing renovations to houses in areas. That's a market trend. But the concept of tearing down really a perfectly good house and putting a bigger house was something that you didn't see before the early 2000s. And we started seeing it here in Vienna on large scale. And I would talk to my colleagues across the state and even nearby, and they're like, we don't have that. We have renovations going on. We don't have tear downs. Why are they tearing down that house? Was it dilapidated? Was it blighted? I'm like, no. It had brand new Anderson windows in it. They just took it down five years later after replacing all the windows. It was unprecedented, and we didn't have some of the tools from planning and zoning and stormwater management. And so that's what I'm saying. Well, I'm kind of proud that Vienna led that charge to update some of those standards and to give us some tools locally to deal with that. And so it's a lot better than it used to be. Anybody that's had a house get torn down right next to them maybe 15, 20 years ago understands the difference. What happens now is much, much different.
Yeah. Well, this is the last question. I feel like I'm sitting down in your office having a conversation. We do this all the time. Finally, last question. What does it mean when we say Virginia is a Dillon Rule state, that the Commonwealth of Virginia is Dillon Rule? What does that mean? Well,
from some of my responses to your earlier questions, you might have guessed, our power is derivative in Virginia for our localities. So there's no assumption that we have local authority, which strikes people as odd a lot of times. They're like, what do you mean? A power comes from the people. right? It's the most powers reserved for the people, and there's even provisions in the U.S. Constitution that says that. If there's nothing in the Constitution, nothing in the law, in the public law, then that's reserved to the people. Well, in Virginia, we have that, but it also says that localities only have the authority that's delegated to them by the General Assembly through the Constitution, through the Charter, and then enabling legislation. So a lot of what we do when we go in our legislative program is ask for enabling legislation. Because the best way to describe the Dillon rule is if the General Assembly hasn't told us we can do it, we can't. And it can be frustrating at times. And again, you say, well, I don't understand. It makes sense that we should be able to do something. But unless the General Assembly's given us authority, we can't. So whenever we pass a local ordinance, the first thing I do is, where's the enabling authority? Where's the enabling statute in the Virginia Code? And so it's a lot better now than it was maybe 20, 30 years ago. A lot of jurisdictions, especially the urban counties, have pushed for more local authority. And that's just the way governments operate in the town. You have counties, cities, and towns. Towns are part of counties. And the whole reason a lot of people would become a town is because counties had very limited authority. So the counties that got to be urban counties, like Fairfax County and Arlington, said, we need more authority. We're just big cities in a lot of ways. So it's much, much better than it is. And so the enabling language in the Virginia Code for localities is much, much broader and gives us a lot more authority than we had 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Good. Well, thanks for answering all these questions and explaining to our residents what the legislative agenda is and what it means for us this year. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate the invitation.
Sure, absolutely. This is a good time to take questions from residents. I don't know if we have residents who are on Zoom who are asking questions or anything like that, or if there are any residents here who would like to ask us any questions. No questions. That means you answered what they're thinking
about that, but it is an exciting subject for us because we deal with it all day long. And I think it's good that the citizens know we have these every year, and they should give their ideas to their council members, the mayor, to you. They can send them into town hall, and we'll certainly look at them and see if it's possible. We may have that authority already, and we'll let them know that.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, if anyone has any questions in the future, maybe tomorrow or next week about the legislative agenda, you certainly can reach out to my office, and I'll pass along the question to our town attorney, and we'll see if we can answer whatever your question is about our legislative agenda. So thank you so much for tuning in to On Deck with Mercury this time about the legislative agenda. Next month, we will be discussing in detail the Liberty Amendments Month planning, which will be coming up in June. We have a lot of activities planned for this year, which should be very exciting for the town of Vienna. And I'll have Leslie Herman, Director of Parks and Recreation, with me, as well as a representative from Historic Vienna, Inc., and that conversation. So I hope everyone stays well and enjoys the beginning of 2021. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.